Hello friends, and welcome back to another episode of But Did You Read the Book? In this video, we're going to analyze and compare Bones and All, written by Camille DeAngelis, and the film of the same name, directed by Luca Guadagnino. If that sounds like your thing, then keep on watching. The book Bones and All follows 16-year-old Marin during the 80s who is living with her mother and has a certain proclivity towards eating her fellow man. Unable to stomach it anymore, Marin's mother abandons her, which in turn puts Marin on a journey to search for her absent father. Along her journey, Marin meets fellow eaters and realizes that she has been looking for answers in all the wrong places and finds a way to accept who she is. Aside from the obvious cannibalism, this is a coming-of-age story about a young woman struggling with who she is and feelings of isolation because of her affliction. And while simple, it also makes her very relatable and accessible. The book and Marin are immediately interesting because of the cannibalism, but I think the cannibalism itself is simply a catalyst that could be easily replaced by alcohol, drugs, depression, or anything else that someone could struggle with. But then that made me think, are the characters interesting because they're genuinely interesting, or are they interesting because they're cannibals? I'm gonna have to go with the latter. Marin, while relatable, is a reclusive teen because of her cannibalism, is extremely naive, too trusting of people, especially her fellow eaters, and consistently puts herself in dangerous situations. Now, I'll give her a little slack because she's 16, but only so much because teens aren't stupid. I mean, they can be, but the sheer amount of stupidity and recklessness that Marin shows throughout the book is substantial. The girl has zero common sense, and that felt more like the author's interpretation of what a teen is versus how they actually are. With that said, I found it very difficult to root for Marin because she continuously put herself in precarious situations despite her history. This is especially true for her victims. In the beginning of the book, we get a very thorough background on Marin's history as an eater. All of her victims, save for her first one, which was a babysitter named Penny, were men who liked her and tried to be intimate with her. Marin would never become intimate with them, rather she'd go for their neck like she was going to kiss them and instead rip their throat out. Now I will say it's not written as such, but it is implied. Marin is very much a black widow in this sense, since she is knowingly luring her victims toward their end despite her better judgment. And this isn't something that happens instantly. As the boys and teens try to court her, she does battle with restraining herself, but continues to allow the situation to play out like she doesn't know how it's going to end. Then there comes a point where she can't deny her urge anymore and she makes the decision to eat them. And the cycle continues. You can see how, from this perspective, cannibalism can be comparable to someone dealing with substance abuse issues or something along those lines. Lee, on the other hand, was the voice of reason. Being older and on his own longer than Marin, Lee knows how to read a situation. He's a survivor through and through, so when Marin would be too trusting of people or not think things through, Lee was there with common sense. One thing I really appreciated about Lee's character was that he was true to himself. He wasn't going to tell Marin what she wanted to hear or do anything he didn't want to do. Lee was resourceful and he had his own code in some sense when it came to eating people. He only ate people he thought the world would be better without. Take that however you like it. I'm not here to judge. It opens a whole can of worms regarding morals and philosophical debate, but it showed that Lee actually put thought into his meals rather than just reaching into the fridge indiscriminately. Then we have Sully, the creepiest of all the creeps. Sully is a much older eater, and he's the first one Marin meets on her journey to find her father. Through her interactions with Sully, we find that Marin isn't the only one. People have lived like this for a long time and have evolved into a new kind of predator. Sully is a freak of nature. He is able to smell other eaters and can also smell when someone is close to death. Like Lee, Sully also has his own code and only eats people who are already deceased, supposedly. There are many layers to what makes Sully creepy. But the two major factors is his obsession with Marin and how eager he is for her to be his companion, despite advising her to stay away from other eaters, and this long rope made of the hair of his victims he keeps as a reminder. Through Sully, we see the extremes of an eater who has lived long enough to know how to blend in unassumingly and has created a system that works for him. Not only that, but by the end we find out that Sully is actually Marin's biological grandfather on her father's side, and the man has been hunting her down because he believes the world is better without them, and he plans on eating her. Now, aside from the relatable but lackluster characters, the writing was well done. If you haven't read the book, you're probably thinking it's extremely graphic and gory, and you'd be right to assume so, but it's not in the slightest, and that is what I really appreciated about DeAngelis' writing. The build-up to the cannibalism scenes are in-depth and go deep into Marin's internal struggle. However, it stops right there before she takes the first bite. DeAngelis never describes the actual consumption, only the build-up and aftermath. But how she does it leaves a lot to the imagination, and that's what she's banking on. She allows the reader to fill in the gaps rather than getting into the bones of the situation. The only scene that she thoroughly describes cannibalism is when Marin meets Sully for the first time, and she finds him gorging himself on the belly of a corpse. Even that description is very short. Overall, the book felt mediocre. The ending was satisfying in a way, but when I finished it, I felt like I had wasted time I'll never get back. And for me, if you take the cannibalism away, then the book is extremely boring and not interesting. The cannibalism is what makes this book a novelty, because it's extreme, it's rare to find in other books, and as a reader, you're curious about the characters' lives, and that's what keeps you reading. The film, on the other hand, well, that's a completely different story. And I mean that literally. I will say that calling Marin and Lee's relationship in the book a love story is a significant stretch. However, director Luca Guadagnino ran with it. The film is very different in this respect since it focuses solely on building a romantic relationship between Lee and Marin and tells this growing love story with a road trip through the Midwest as the backdrop. In the book, they do find comfort and companionship in each other, but it is more of a one-sided infatuation on Marin's part that is more akin to a crush than full-fledged love. There are some other major changes as well. Specifically, Marin is 18 instead of 16, and she is far more street smart and skeptical of others in the film compared to the book. She is trusting to an extent, but not naive like in the book, which was nice. Also, Marin is with her father, and it is he who abandons her, which in turn makes Marin go on a journey to find her mother, Janelle. When she finds her mother in the mental institution, she's coherent enough to know who Marin is and tries to eat her because she believes they are monsters and the world is better without them. The background story for Lee is different as well. It's no longer his ex-girlfriend and what she witnessed that made him leave town, but his drunk and abusive father that he ate. So needless to say, Lee has some issues. Another big change was that Sully is not related to Marin in the film. He is simply a random eater that becomes obsessed with Marin and is seeking a companion. And that significantly undercut the sinister nature of Sully and reduced him to a stalker, which is still bad, but Sully in the book is definitely more evil, which adds to the shock and creepiness of his character, rather than him just being some lonely eater that wants someone to spend his time with. I will say that Mark Rylance absolutely killed it playing Sully. He definitely gave the full creep vibe, and I was disturbed to say the least. Another major difference, and possibly the one that really brought the film down a peg for me personally, was the ending. Denial and acceptance are major themes throughout the book, and we see Marin struggling with denying what she is and feeling ashamed for the victims she's had over the years. Then she meets Lee, who has a strong sense of self, and he feels no shame for what he does. It is this relationship with Lee that allows Marin to accept and embrace who she is, and I think that's the overarching point of the book, that no matter what you're going through, you should not feel ashamed, and no one should ever shame you for the things you've done or who you are. Cannibalism is an extreme, but the author's point gets across. At the end of the book, Marin ends up eating Lee after getting drunk and learns to accept who she is and live a life that is her own. In the film, on the other hand, Marin finds acceptance with Lee through their love for each other, but not in the sense of fully accepting herself as she is. I think the film has such a strong emphasis on the romance and about two people becoming one that it negated the deep interpersonal work that Marin was doing in the book. At the end of the film, when Sully finds Marin again, Lee ends up getting stabbed trying to protect her. It's while he's bleeding to death that he tells Marin to eat him, and she ultimately does. The final shot of the film is Lee and Marin embracing each other in a field we see them from earlier. It's symbolic of them being one, and now they really are one because Marin ate him. But again, it really undermined the character's development we see in the book. So it was disappointing on that front, because there really wasn't much character development outside from Lee and Marin getting to know each other and becoming more vulnerable and honest with each other. That aspect of the film makes the book seem better than it actually is. Not because it's a great book, but because the film just wasn't as good, and it makes the book seem better by default. Which is disappointing because I had high expectations for the film. I knew from the trailers that the film was going in a slightly different direction, which I thought was a good thing initially. Then you had Taylor Russell as Marin, Timothée Chalamet as Lee, and Mark Rylance as Sully, all of whom are phenomenal actors. Each played their role extremely well and brought a level of humanity to the characters that translated very well from the book. What I appreciated most about the actors was the subtle acting. The film doesn't have a lot of big or explosive moments. It's very nuanced and quiet, and the actors' expressions and movements reflected that. Taylor Russell was able to convey so much emotion and what she was thinking with the subtlest of expressions, and it was beautiful. There was also a scene where Lee finally tells Marin what happened with his father, and Timothée Chalamet is so vulnerable and cries, and in that moment he feels seen. As a viewer, you can feel his relief at finally letting this weight go and being accepted by Marin. It translated across the screen. I think this film expanded both Taylor Russell's and Timothée Chalamet's range when it came to subtle acting. From a production perspective, the film was very simple, but in a good way. The movie was shot on film, which gave it a great old school grittiness that made it fit more with the 80s era. The lighting in the scenes were very dark and moody, and the sets were simple. This is a road trip film after all, so we spent a lot of time in a car or driving, and in the moments when the characters did stay somewhere or camped outside, the lighting really played a key role in setting the tone and reflecting where they were. One thing we can't ignore are the prosthetics and gore when it came to the cannibalism scenes. They were graphic, as you'd expect, however, those scenes were extremely short-lived. I appreciated that they didn't linger or draw out the cannibalism scenes. They showed just enough in the beginning to get the point across, probably no more than 30 seconds or a minute, then moved on to the aftermath. I will say that the blood did look unrealistic at times. There were scenes where it was extremely dark, and I'm not sure if it's because of how it was made or because of it being shot on film versus digital. That leads me into costume design. Overall, it was very simple. Marin wore the same dress throughout the entire film. Lee, on the other hand, was much more fun. While he wears the same jeans throughout the film, Lee's shirts often changed based on the victims he ate. When they didn't show him eating his victim, he could be found wearing a shirt or a hat from his victim in the next scene, which I thought was a humorous and subtle way of implying what he'd done. It also spoke to Lee's souvenirs he would take of his victims, as he did in the book. Marin takes souvenirs as well in the book, but this isn't touched on in the film. Alright, let's get into my final thoughts. Overall, I thought the book was okay. It's definitely not something I'd read again, and the only thing that made it interesting was the cannibalism, in my opinion. If you remove that or replace that with something else like drugs, it probably would have fallen flat. But the message of accepting yourself and living without shame is something I think we can all take away from it. The movie, on the other hand, was just as lackluster, and the changes they made didn't add any significant value. The acting was great, and the decision to shoot on film was perfect, and how they shot and executed the cannibalism scenes was very tastefully done, and they weren't too disturbing or too distracting from the entire film. But the focus on the love story rather than Marin's personal growth definitely made it less satisfying. From a cinematic perspective, the film was well done, but from an adaptation and story lens, it took an already lacking story and somehow made it even more lacking. I think if you haven't read the books, you would like the film and find more to salvage from it. You don't need to read the book to see the movie, and I honestly can't say which is better or worse, or recommend either. I had high expectations going into the film and no expectations when reading the book. And honestly, in the worst case scenario, I'm indifferent to both. Now you've heard my thoughts, and now I want to hear yours. Comment below what you thought about the book or the film. Do you agree or disagree? Was there something I missed? Let's talk about it. If you made it this far and you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more, be sure to subscribe. If you have a recommendation that you'd like me to review, then please comment it below and you just might see it in a future video. Alright, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you have a beautiful day. I hope you're doing well, and I'll see you next time.